on my computer, and we'll begin with sharing the first map here. Okay, so the first wars of the kingdom of Judah after the defection of Israel and after Shishak's, here comes Susan. So I guess we'll do every fourth verse.
Looks like.
How about that?
Now I'll be confused.
Susan's
I'll have too many marks.
You want a pencil?
You just marked them all up.
I did.
I know. Okay. Sorry you have to mark your papers again, but now you can do every fourth verse. Good for you, Susan? Hello?
She's muted.
You're muted.
I apologize. I logged into the wrong date.
Oh, that's okay. So you've got every fourth verse there, Susan.
Okay, I gotcha.
Okay. So here we go. The first wars of the kingdom of Judah after the defection of Israel and after Shishak's invasion can all be described as like a test of strength with Israel. You might remember back in session 6 about the early days of Israel, where King Asa of Judah had called upon Ben-Hadad I of Damascus to go against his former sister kingdom, Israel, after the split of the monarchy. And I said at that time that was going to end up being a bad move down the road. This caused Israel, the northern kingdom, to focus north to this new threat, and so it broke off any immediate desires that they may have had against Judah. But King Asa then accepted the split of the monarchy, and he began fortifying his northern border with Israel, starting with building the fortresses here at Geba. I can zoom in. Here at Geba and at Mizpah. While King Baasha, the next king of Israel, had his hands full, warding off the Damascenes to the north, King Asa was able to establish the border with Israel on basically a topographically secure line that leaned very heavily on the deep wadis that ran east and west along this line. The Wadi Beth Hanana, which isn't depicted here, and the Wadi Suanit, which is depicted on this map. To block the approach to Jerusalem, even on this narrow strip plateau, King Asa, or we're not really sure, one of his successors, renewed the fortifications of Gibeah, located here, 3 miles north of the capital. Consequently, for the immediate defense of Jerusalem from the north, you have basically a quadrilateral of fortifications comprising Geba, Mizpah, Gibeon, and Gibeah, these four right here. When you're hemmed in by formidable powers and by vassal states, as well as being hit by nomadic tribes from the desert, Judah has always been continually compelled to look to its defenses. When King Asa had completed the task of securing his northern border, he continued his fortifying activities by filling in the gaps in Rehoboam's fortress belt. So we have the first reading, Bonnie, 2 Chronicles 14, 6 through 7.
He built up the fortified cities of Judah, since the land was at peace. No one was at war with him during those years, for the Lord gave him rest. Let us build up these towns, he said to Judah, and put walls around them, with towers, gates, and bars. The land is still ours, because we have sought the Lord our God. We sought him, and he has given us rest on every side. So they built and prospered.
Okay, so from this passage, we can say that King Asa's fortifications were completed with the full cooperation of the entire population in a continuous common national effort. The inhabitants of each city to be fortified may have also contributed labor and material aid according to some specific royal assessment that was levied on them. Further large-scale fortifications were recorded from the time of King Jehoshaphat, and that's in 2 Chronicles 17:12. Ken?
Jehoshaphat became more and more powerful. He built forts and store cities in Judah.
Okay, so in contrast to his father, King Asa, King Jehoshaphat concentrated on the double task of plugging up the gaps between the main fortified towns with forts, strong points, and other minor works, and refurbishing the logistics infrastructure of the national defense. This latter task of building back up the logistics infrastructure was accomplished by operating logistics bases, or as the Bible puts it, store cities, on much of the same lines that were used back during the United Monarchy days. The standard pattern of Judean and Israelite fortresses was squarish, with square protruding towers and crenellated battlements. Special attention was also paid to the gates. In fortified towns where the walls followed the contours of the elevation of the land they were built on, the gates were usually in the form of a strong tower with a narrow gateway that could be closed by two sets of doors on heavy bolts. Excavations, stray biblical passages, and a host of murals and other paintings and reliefs from Egyptian sources, Assyrian sources, and other sources allows us to reconstruct the Israelite fortifications. From the city of Dan all the way to the north, all the way down to the oasis at Kadesh Barnea on the confines of the Sinai, which is off the map to the south, and it's where I am today, as you can tell. Israelite fortifications evolved, which proved that building was carried out according to standardized techniques and specifications. The frequently used type of curtain wall was the so-called casement wall. Let me show you a picture of what I'm talking about. Let's see here. This is a picture of a casement wall. It's a double wall, as you can see, that's connected by internal partitions, and you can barely see one right there. And these partitions divide the space in between the two outside walls into square compartments or casements. And these would often be filled up with rubble or earth or the like. And they provide the walls with considerable width and resilience. This mode of construction was aimed at minimizing the effects of undermining devices and breaching devices.
Okay.
After the improved battering ram was introduced by the Assyrians, the chances that this new weapon would either be caught between the filling of the casement or would batter it into an even more solid mass were personally pretty reasonably good. Furthermore, the flat roof of the casements served as a much wider battlement area than the narrow single wall designs. Finally, the width of these walls created a new secure zone for movement on the inside, since it was nearly impossible to cover this by enemy missiles, being stones from slings or arrows, which made for easy movement in the immediate rear of the battle zone. So if you can imagine, this is, of course, just the very bottom of an old casement wall. It was much higher, obviously. But if you can imagine, if you're on the outside and you're shooting arrows or slinging stones, you have to go over the wall to get to the inside. And if you go over the wall, then they're going to land out here away from the interior wall. So this space right near the inside of the wall was free from any falling debris or missiles or stones. So they were able to move in this area rather securely.
Byron,
Let me show you. Yeah.
how high were the walls?
Ooh. I can't give you a number. But from the ones that remain standing, they look to be about anywhere from 40 to 60 feet.
Hmm.
But that's an estimate from what I can see.
Wow, pretty deep, pretty tall.
Let's see. Here's let me share this picture with you. This is a really poor picture. If I zoom in, it's very pixelated and it's hard to see. But as you can see here, this is at the fortress of Arad, and you can see it's obviously a casement wall. You can tell by the width at the top. So if you were out here and you're trying to throw something over the wall, as you can see, it can't land very close to the inside of the wall, which makes that a secure zone. But this is very typical of both Israelite and Judean fortresses, squarish in nature, with square protruding towers at the gates. Pretty typical. Later on in the video, you'll see another picture of this, which is a little better, from the air, and you'll also get a direct overhead shot from the air. But as you can see here, it's kind of hard to estimate the height unless somebody was actually standing there. Beersheba's 10th century walls were solid. Then a century later, they were changed into casement walls. Kadesh Barnea, which was built in the 9th or the 8th century BC, was always a casement structure. Casement fortresses, that's a junk call. Good, they hung up. Casement fortresses continued to be built in Palestine down to the end of the Byzantine period. And then in the late Roman times, this type of casement wall design began to spread out from the east over all of the Roman Empire. And the fortresses in Rome and in Britain and fortresses during the Middle Ages in Germany were very much like those of the Israelites that were built 1,000 years earlier. The main drawbacks in any type of fortifications are the lack of depth in comparison to, say, a battle in the open field, as well as a lack of flexibility. To minimize the tactical effect, one or more devices were employed together. Double walls, sally ports and passages, a glacis at the foot of the wall, and a moat. The fortress at Lachish had double walls, a glacis and a moat, while Mizpah had wall glacis and moats. Now, the purpose of the glacis, and the best way I can describe what a glacis is, if you imagine you're standing on the outside of the fortress and you're facing a solid wall, but at the foot of that wall, it would be built out at an angle towards you. So it kind of looks like a foot that's angled towards the enemy at the bottom of the wall. And the purpose of that glacis and moats together was to stop a hostile assault short of the walls, beneath the lines, within adequate distance of the accuracy and effectiveness of bows and slings, and protecting the base, again, from easy undermining and breaching, because that means that they would have to breach a much thicker wall at the bottom. And because they were angled, a ram would be basically bounced up. It was hard to get a ram to go into a glacis because of that angle, if you can picture that. Among the major components of all major fortifications were the towers that protruded from the curtains, and they dominated the battlements. When the defenders were unable to hit the enemy at the foot of the walls without exposing themselves, the men that were posted on the towers could shoot along, parallel the walls and their immediate area from relatively secure positions. And this enfilading fire or flanking fire has retained its decisive quality even in present-day field fortifications. The placement of towers was within bowshot distance of each other, was obviously the rule. Something else I want to share with you, and in my next email, I'll send you the link to this. It's called the virtual New Testament, but it's a 3D depiction. And I first have to share with you my entire screen to be able to launch this.
Wow.
There. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Here's the city of Jerusalem. Now this is how the city looked during Jesus' lifetime on earth. This is what it looked like then. So this would be 1st century AD Jerusalem. And if I zoom into here, this is fun to play with. Like I said, I'll send you the link. But here's a perfect example of casement walls. And you see this is called crenellated battlements. These little knobs that you see on the towers and the walls, that's the crenellation I was talking about. And you can see how the walls follow the contour of the land. It zigzags in and out, it goes down, it goes up. And notice that wherever there's a gate, there are large protruding square towers. If I jump over to here, again, you can see the perfect example of an Israelite fortress. But you'll like this because all of these little dots that you see are all points of interest that you can explore. I'll let you do that on your own. For example, here's the Garden Tomb is located there, and Calvary is located there. You can even take a 3D tour inside the temple. You can start out here and basically walk all the way through this whole area. But this, I bring this up to give you the perfect idea of what a typical fortress looked like in Israel. And there you have it. It's called the Virtual New Testament. Let's see. Special attention was paid to the gates, the most vulnerable spot in any fortress. In its most sophisticated form, the approach to the gates was guarded by a double set of gate towers, such as at Megiddo, Samaria, and Lachish. If the enemy penetrated the outer gate, the attacker would find himself channeled in this little narrow passage between the gate that they just broke through and the next gate, which was just as strong as the first one. And this little channel had firing positions all along its sides, exposing the enemy to crossfire from 2, sometimes 3 and 4 directions at once. A secure water source could make all the difference in withstanding a siege. The engineers were able to tap very deep subterranean water tables, or even to tunnel hidden passages to outside sources of water, such as Hatzor, Megiddo, Gibeon, and Azekah. These are good examples. And in next week's session, I'll show you some unbelievable pictures of one of these underground tunnels that was hacked through solid rock, specifically Jerusalem's source. It's amazing. Roads leading up to the gates were planned specifically so that the attacker had to wheel to the right to face the gate. In other words, roads leading up to the gates were purposely made so that you parallel the wall, with the wall being on the right side of the enemy. So when as the road reaches near the top to where the gate is, the enemy would have to make a sharp right turn to hit the gate. The reason they did that was, well, there was a couple of reasons. When the attacker has to make that turn, they lose momentum. and they exposed their right side, which is the unprotected by his shield, and so doubly vulnerable to the defenders. Most people were right-handed, so they carried their weapon in their right hand and they carried their shield in their left hand. Well, as you're walking along this road where the fortress is on the right, your shield's on the wrong side, okay? So you were also vulnerable to attack at that point. In situations like this, the left-handed Benjamites came in very handy since they could use their slings or bows with their left hand while guarding themselves with their right. Which brings us to the matter of siegecraft. A military man, to a military man, it kind of goes without saying that the art of defense and the art of siege are actually complementary. And it's difficult to say whether Vauban, who lived in 1633 to 1707, or the Dutchman Cohorn, who lived right about the same time, are they to be remembered most as builders of fortifications or as the inventors of the means and ways to destroy them? Because they did both. These guys were geniuses at designing and building fortresses, and then they became geniuses at designing siege weapons that could destroy the forts that they invented. So with the development of the art of fortifications, the Israelites from the days of the United Monarchy onwards became very adept at all forms of siege warfare. And the procedure of a siege is very concisely described by the prophet Ezekiel in a warning that he gave of the fate that was awaiting Jerusalem. And that would be Jim, Ezekiel 4:2.
4:2. Says, then lay siege to it. Erect siege works against it, build a ramp up to it, set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it.
Ezekiel also prophesies about Tyre's doom at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, which would occur years later. Remember, Tyre was an ally of the sister kingdom Israel. And that's found in Ezekiel 26, 8 and 9, which I think is now Susan's turn.
Right.
He will ravage your settlements on the mainland with the sword. He will set up siege works against you, build a ramp up to your walls, and raise his shields against you. He will direct the blows of his battering rams against your walls and demolish your towers with his weapons.
Okay. Also, Jeremiah visualized the siege of Jerusalem, and that's in Jeremiah 6:6. And that's back to the top.
I got
Or Jim?
that one. This
Okay.
is what the Lord Almighty says. Cut down the trees and build siege ramps against Jerusalem. This city must be punished. It is filled with oppression.
Okay. Now, the ramps that they're talking about here in all these passages were built to fill up any obstacles, such as moats, to gain enough height to apply scaling ladders and rams. So if you can imagine a wall, let's say it's 60 feet high, they would build these ramps with stone and logs and dirt. And it would take weeks, sometimes months, to build this long ramp up as high as they could get it on the wall, high enough where they could go the rest of the way with scaling ladders, and high enough to attack it successfully with rams.
Right.
Yeah.
Why,
Oh.
why did the people that were inside the walls, why did they allow them to do it? Why didn't they continually battle them so they couldn't build the ramp?
Well, I'm sure that they did, but they would. There would be shield bearers protecting the workers doing this, and they started way off, and they slowly built it up. So, yeah, I'm sure they wouldn't let it go unmolested, and that may be one of the reasons why it would take weeks and months to build one of these things. if you're dislodging stones from the lower part of the walls, it was not always the best way of battering away inside a fortress. But if you could aim the ram near the top of the wall, the crumbling wall would carry with it a portion of those battlements and the defenders that were on it with it. Moreover, the fallen debris that would fall on the inside from this constant battering would also form a continuation of the ramp, which would afford a traversable approach into the breach. So they had a way down from the inside of the wall. But the biblical narrative has left almost no account of the Israelite sappers at work, except there is a passage from Joab's siege of Abel Beth Makkah, which proves that the Israelites applied all the above methods, and as early as King David's time. So, Ken, you got 2 Samuel 20:15?
Yeah, all the troops with Joab came and besieged Sheba in Beth Makkah. They built a siege ramp up to the city, and it stood against the outer fortifications while they were battering the wall to bring it down.
Okay. And you might remember that Abel Beth Makkah is one of the towns up in the far north of Israel, near the city of Dan. It was part of the Naphtali line that we talked about last week. I don't know if you remember that. The ram was, of course, used from the earliest times. And when it was first used, we don't really know. It was first represented on an Egyptian fresco in the 12th dynasty, which is about the 20th century BC. In the time of King David, it might well have already developed into a device with a hardened, often ram-shaped head, hence the name, often with a metal cap, which was either swung in a harness from a scaffolding or was carried by men who were charging at something that they wished to breach. The Ben Hassan ram had a really sharp edge on it, which can pry loose bricks and masonry by breaking up the joints. Siege warfare, which involved the entire non-combatant population inside the town of the fortress, was governed by a strict rule. It was sort of an unwritten rule of the ancient powers to be. Before any hostile action, peace was always offered in return for surrender to the besieging army. If the offer was refused, the town's adult male population was liable to be put to death and all of its property confiscated. Another Old Testament law governing siege warfare is found in Deuteronomy 20:19-20. Maureen, Jim?
That's Deuteronomy 20:19-20. When you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees people that you should besiege them? However, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees and use them to build siege works until a city at war with you falls.
Okay.
Smart.
So smart, yeah. So the army manning the defenses and operating from inside this vast fortified system comprised, as in the United Monarchy and in the Northern Kingdom, both a regular nucleus and the national levy. The regulars included the royal guards, the hand-picked infantry named runners, and of course the charioteers. It seems feasible that the runners were trained to fight as a team with the chariots in mutually supporting formations. The size of the regular army must have varied in accordance with the state of the country's economic prosperity. Troops were deployed in the fortresses partly as stationary garrisons, partly as mobile forces to patrol, maneuver, and fight mainly in the open. The largest contingent of mobile field forces was, of course, quartered as before with the king in Jerusalem. The forces were formed in the by now familiar tactical divisions of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. The major difference, though, between Judah and Israel was the Judean preponderance of the infantry as the main offensive arm. The defense of the Judean mountains made the emphasis on foot soldiers mandatory. Much of the broad valleys like the Jezreel and plains of the north demanded the development of chariotry. Yet chariots did exist in the Judean army. In fact, the chariot was in fact the royal vehicle of war from which the Judean king and the kings of Egypt and the kings of Assyria, Babylon, and then later Persia all rode to battle in a chariot. The chariot forces in Judah were more than just a token force. This was only logical, because whenever Judah extended its domains over the Negev desert in the south and the kingdom of Edom and Transjordan and the Mediterranean coastal plain where the Philistines lived, mobile chariotry in sizable numbers was going to be needed in those open spaces. The importance of infantry in the Judean army is found in a severely mutilated inscription from the war of the Syrian coalition that was headed by King Uzziah of Judah against Tiglath-Pileser. These troops certainly included levies from the National Service Army, and we have some information about that, and it's in 2 Chronicles 14, verse 8, which is, who's up next?
Susan. Susan.
Okay.
Asa had an army of 300,000 men from Judah, equipped with large shields and with spears, and 280,000 from Benjamin, armed with small shields and with bows. All these were brave men fighting.
So the traditional tribal proficiencies in warfare were evidently still being carried on all the way back to the exodus from Egypt. The tribe of Judah provided the pikemen, while the Benjaminites continued their tradition as archers. The numbers quoted are nevertheless greatly overestimated.
Okay.
With a total population of 1 million inhabitants, it's questionable if even a tenth could be marshaled for war at the same time. And we're talking about only the able-bodied males over age 20. An army list from the days of King Jehoshaphat enumerates 5 main divisions of the people's army under their commanders. And he uses basically the same numbers. So that would be 2 Chronicles 17, 14-9, which goes back to Bonnie. Oh, you got the hard one, Bonnie, sorry.
Their enrollment by families was as follows. From Judah, commanders of units of 1,000. Adnah, the commander, with 300,000 fighting men. Next, Jehohanan, the commander, with 280,000. Next, Amaziah, son of Zikri, who volunteered himself for the service of the Lord, with 200,000. From Benjamin, Eliada, a valiant soldier, with 200,000 men armed with bows and shields. Next, Jehozabad, with 180,000 men armed for battle. These were the men who served the king. Besides those, he stationed in fortified cities throughout Judah.
Okay, wow, that's a lot of people. The People's Army was therefore built in 5 divisions, which may, like the 12 divisions of the former United Monarchy, furnished, according to a fixed schedule, reserves on active duty for a fixed period every year. If we take out the last 0 from each of these figures, the whole of the people in arms would come to about 116,000, which is indeed possible. The 5 divisions seem to have been combat divisions, which were recruited from the 12 administrative divisions of the kingdom. Now, don't confuse this with the 12 tribes. During the United Monarchy, obviously there were 12 tribes, and back during David's and Solomon's time, those 12 tribes would rotate supporting the army for 1 month out of every year. The kingdom is now split, but what the kingdom of Judah did, they divided Judah into 12 administrative divisions just within the kingdom of Judah. King Jehoshaphat was able to reconstruct this Solomonic infrastructure of basing the upkeep of his administration and army on 12 districts, each of which was responsible for the provisions for 1 month. But because of limited manpower in each of these districts, it didn't suffice for the formation of 12 district divisions, however. So 2 or more districts would have to combine to furnish the 5 divisions, which served either with a full complement for about 11 weeks annually, or half their strength served twice a year for about a month. You might recall back in session 7, when we talked about Israel under Omri and Ahab, we covered the combined wars of Israel and Judah during the reigns of Ahab and Jehoram of Israel and Jehoshaphat of Judah. Now we turn our focus to the Negev, the south of the Judean kingdom, which was solely a Judean concern without any cooperation from Israel. The term Negev means dry country, and it comprises about 4,800 square miles between Beersheba and Etzion Geber, which is on the Gulf of Aqaba. With an average precipitation of 6 inches a year, the Negev could support only a nomad population. And since the Negev is also a climatic border zone, fluctuations in even this minimum amount of rain are frequent, as well as the subterranean sources feeding springs and wells. In dry periods, the only means of surviving for the nomads was in gaining access by any means, friendly or otherwise, to the arable country, which had more enduring sources of water and a variety of pasture lands, as well as access to crops and plants that were being grown by the locals. So what I'll do now is share with you that video.
Yeah, Negev, so they're gonna come in and take everything.
Here we go.
Negev means south or dry. As can be seen on map 12, today the Negev refers to the triangular-shaped region from the city of Beersheba all the way south to Eilat and Aqaba, port cities on a bay leading to the Red Sea. This area is 120 miles or 190 kilometers long. For the most part, the Negev is not sandy, but is a high, rocky desert. Let's overview the different regions on map 112. Starting with the northern Negev. In the Bible, the northern Negev is often called simply the Negev. Therefore, this region can be called the biblical Negev, pronounced Negeb in many English translations. For instance, in Numbers 13:17, when Moses sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan, he said to them, "Go up into the Negeb and go up into the hill country." As a relatively flat plain, the biblical Negev functions as an important east-west route, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to Transjordan, south of the Dead Sea.
I'll pause just a second here. The fortress that you see there at the top of this hill is the same one I showed you earlier. That's the fortress at Arad, Tel Arad.
South of the biblical Negev is the wilderness of Zin, a region of rocky highlands that was the southern border of the Promised Land. Further south is the wilderness of Paran, also a rocky desert, where the first generation of Israelites who came out of Egypt died. Between the wilderness of Zin and wilderness of Paran is a huge crater, carved out in the past by a tremendous amount of rushing water. In Hebrew, a crater is Maktesh. This is Maktesh Ramon, the exalted crater. Note the site of Kadesh Barnea, just to the west of Maktesh Ramon. Kadesh Barnea was the main camp of the Israelites during the 40-year sojourn in the desert. On the southern end of map 112 are Etzion Geber and Eilat, port cities on a bay of the Red Sea that reaches to the Indian Ocean. The Arava is the long plain that stretches between the Gulf of Eilat and the Dead Sea. The Arava is part of the great Syro-African Rift Valley. East of the Arava is the high plateau called Mount Seir. Descendants of Jacob's brother Esau settled here and became known as the nation of Edom. North of Edom, between the deep Zered and Arnon River canyons, was Moab, a nation descended from Abraham's nephew Lot. Now, let's go back and take a closer look at the biblical Negev. Map 113 is a magnified version of the northern biblical Negev. At the center of the biblical Negev is the city of Beersheba, which means well of the oath or promise. The patriarch Abraham named the site when he made a covenant with the Philistine king of Gerar. But at the same time, Abraham confirmed his faith in God's promise that Abraham's own descendants would inherit the land. Keep in mind that towns like Beersheba in the Negev secured the route that runs from the Mediterranean Sea near Gaza to Edom, east of the Dead Sea.
We're standing in the region of Beersheba. You can see the modern city of Beersheba behind us. And it was the southern border of the heartland of Israel. For instance, David's census was taken from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south.
Here we are at Beersheba, and we are about to descend into a water system that dates back to King Hezekiah.
Both Abraham's and David's Beersheba was most likely located where the modern city of Beersheba is today. However, this nearby ruin, called Tel Sheva, is a good example of an Israelite period town. The excavated ruins here include a city wall, a city gate, houses, large rectangular buildings which were used as storehouses for grain, wine, and oil, an animal sacrificial altar, which was most likely removed during the reign of King Hezekiah of Judah, and a deep shaft cut to gain access to water stored in caverns below the city. Water is scarce in the Negev, especially during the long, dry summer. Therefore, the Negev is a region where one must learn, like the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to trust in God for daily provision and protection. Between 10 and 14 inches of rain can fall each year during the winter season. When it rains, it can rain hard, and the normally dry stream beds, which drain hundreds of square miles of territory, converge into the brook Besor, which flows to the Mediterranean Sea just south of Gaza. Towns were built near the Negev wadis or streams for access to water. This mound is a ruin of an Assyrian fortress called Yurtza, built astride Nahal Besor, that flows toward the coast and the Mediterranean Sea. The normally dry, far-reaching, flowing streams in the Negev serve as a metaphor in Psalm 126 to describe the hope of exiled Israelites that God would bring them back to their land.
Hi, we're in the Negev highlands near where the Israelites wandered, and normally it's very dry here, but we've had a couple good rains lately, and as you can see, there's a lot of water here right now. Streams flowing in the desert.
Great.
Here we are in the town near Beersheba in the biblical Negev, and it has been raining the last few days in the hill country. And you can see how the waters are rushing down through this stream, which is usually very, very dry. So the psalmist in Psalm 126 uses this image. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negev.
The western Negev blends into the agriculturally rich coastal plain. Note another tributary of the brook Besor, the Nahal Gerar. Note two important sites, Gerar and Ziklag. Abraham was a man of faith who believed God's promises. However, Abraham wasn't perfect and had occasional lapses of faith. At Gerar, he lied about his wife Sarah. But Abraham was quick to realize his mistakes and return to God in faith. At Beersheba, Abraham not only made a treaty with his human neighbors, but reconfirmed his faith in God's promise that one day Abraham's descendants would inherit the land. Beersheba means well of the promise. Likewise at Beersheba, Abraham's grandson Jacob, even though he was leaving the promised land for Egypt, expressed faith in God's promise that God would bring Israel's descendants out of Egypt and back into the promised land. Like Abraham and Jacob, we are called to believe the promises of God. Map 5.4 shows that before he became king, David lived for 16 months at Ziklag. Like Abraham, David was another person who expressed great faith in God, but at Ziklag his faith lapsed. It is probably not a coincidence that two central people associated with God's promises, Abraham and David, temporarily failed in faith, so geographically close to each other. While David and his men were away from Ziklag, their wives and families were captured by a raiding band of Amalekites. The Amalekites then burned Ziklag. When David and his men returned to Ziklag and saw the devastation, David's own men wanted to stone him. But all this served to show David that he had not been living in faith toward God. He repented and asked God for direction. In pursuit of the Amalekites, they came to the brook Besor, where 200 men stayed with the baggage. 400 others continued the pursuit and were able to defeat the Amalekites and recover their families. This is a photograph of Tel Serah, likely the ruins of ancient Ziklag. In the eastern Negev, note the location of Tel Arad. Tel Arad has remains from both an early Canaanite city and an Israelite period fortress. The Canaanite ruins are visible in the lower part of the screen. The Canaanite city flourished at the same time as Sodom and Gomorrah to the east, probably in association with minerals mined from the Dead Sea. The Israelite or Judean fortress is on the summit of the hill. It was originally built around the time of King Solomon and went through a number of destruction and rebuilding phases. The fortress contained a temple or high place.
We're in Arad in the biblical Negev, and Nicole and I are standing here in the Holy of Holies of an Israelite temple.
In the Bible, these are known as high places.
And I'm standing in the Holy of Holies where there were standing stones and pillars for the burning of incense. And these places were condemned by the prophets and was probably destroyed by Hezekiah.
In the next video, the Negev, Part 2, we will take a closer look at the regions further south on Map 112, the wilderness of Zin and the wilderness of Paran.
Okay. Let me bring 12 back. Okay, so after the foundation of the monarchy, the permanent task of its kings was to safeguard and secure life in the country by maintaining a secure grip on the southern borders. In other words, a line of border defenses specially adapted to repelling the nomadic raiders from the Negev and beyond was essential to the maintenance of peace in Judah. The natural line of defense is that of the largely steep-sided deep gorge of the brook Besor, Beersheba, and it's hard to follow this line, but here's the brook Besor, and then it changes into the river Beersheba, and then it changes into the river Malhata, all the way down. And these are tributaries. The Malhatna flows into the Beersheba, which flows into the brook Besor. This forms a continuous line of demarcation that can be turned into an effective line of defense when it's appropriately fortified and well patrolled. To make the line effective, depth was needed, since the swift raiders from the desert were capable of penetrating any kind of linear defense. Between the main bases of the river line and the upper slopes of the Hebron mountains located here, a constantly growing number of sites have been uncovered. And we have to sort of imagine the desert raiding parties becoming entangled in this network of mutually supporting fortified locations. The major value of the Negev beyond the river line was as a connecting link between the land and sea commerce that converged on Edom and the Gulf of Eilat on one side and the Philistine plain on the other. The districts of Edom, the Negev, and the Philistine coast were always linked by common commercial interests. Both the Edomites and the Philistines were interested in maintaining good relations with the nomads in the Negev, who already included Arab tribes. So as to ensure the flow of goods from one commercial center to the other, they wanted to maintain a good relationship with the nomads. The establishment of the Israelite monarchy added a fourth interested party to this, and Israelite supremacy over the whole Negev could be exploited either passively by demanding a share in the profits of the existing trade, or actively by development of new trade routes through the diversion of part of the flow of trade into or through Israelite domain. Both methods were used. By diverting part of the north-south trade along the Palestinian land bridge into an easterly direction, and by capturing part of the Egyptian Red Sea trade monopoly through the development of the port at Etzion Geber or nearby Eilat, they're right next to each other, and channeling off some of the Red Sea traffic from the Egyptian ports. All the other interested parties, here's Etzion Geber, and here's Eilat down here at the bottom. And this is the Gulf of Aqaba, which leads to the Red Sea, which leads to the Indian Ocean. All the other interested parties were united in their desire to sabotage this newly arrived Israelite competitor. To safeguard the desert routes and trade stations from Solomonic times onwards, the Israelites were forced to fortify and control the trans-Negev desert routes and the main sources of water in the wilderness. The first system of fortified desert routes was clearly Solomonic. The reoccupation of the southern Negev was the achievement of King Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 17:11. Whoever's next.
Some Philistines brought Jehoshaphat gifts and silver as tribute, and the Arabs brought him flocks, 7,700 rams and 7,700 goats.
So note that the tributes of the Philistines and the Arabs are mentioned together. They were brought to heel not only by the exercise of military power, but by the economic pressure that was brought to bear by the Judean mastery of the Negev desert. The third factor in the Negev also was during King Jehoshaphat's reign, and it's mentioned in the Bible much like an afterthought, and that's in 1 Kings 22:47. That would be Jim.
There was then no king in Edom, a provincial governor ruled.
So we can tell from here that the Edomite problem evidently has been solved by complete annexation of the kingdom by Judah, and a Judean governor has been established in the capital city at Edom. With the stage now set, the way is open to renew the Red Sea trade. 1 Kings 22:48-49. Susan.
Now Jehoshaphat built a fleet of trading ships to go to Ophir for gold, but they never set sail. They were wrecked at Ezon Geber. At that time, Hazael, son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, "Let my man sail with yours." But Jehoshaphat refused.
Okay, so while Ahaziah was the king up in Israel, Jehoshaphat was the king down in Judah. Rather than let the northern kingdom become too closely involved in the Negev, King Jehoshaphat declined the offer of the men of Israel, who had by this time gained some valuable nautical experience. Now, the city of Ophir for gold, nobody's really sure where this city is located. Most scholars believe it's on the west coast of India, which sort of makes sense, because when you sail, when you leave the port of Aqaba or Etzion Geber here, and head south down the Gulf of Aqaba into the Red Sea goes right into the Indian Ocean, and it's a very close trip over to the west coast of India from there. Where on the west coast of India is still dispute. There's like three places where it could have been, but nobody really knows for sure. Jehu's revolt and the subsequent weakening of Israel had its immediate repercussions in the south. 2 Kings 8, 20, 21.
Time of Jehoram, Edom rebelled against Judah and set up its own king. So Jehoram went to Zair with all his chariots. The Edomites surrounded him and his chariot commanders, but he rose up and broke through by night. His army, however, fled back home.
Okay, when you first read this passage, it doesn't make sense. Why would the king, who was victorious, did they abandon the battlefield and disperse in flight? But if you look at it a little more closer, a solution kind of presents itself. After a very difficult and tiring approach march, which necessitated manhandling chariots and possibly even dismantling them so as to negotiate the narrow, rocky, steep passages, the Judean army redeployed in the plains south of the Dead Sea, and that would be located right here. So the approach had to come through the wilderness of the Negev. This is very rugged country through here. So they managed to then redeploy in this plain. At night, the army camped in or near the oasis at Zor, located right here. And because of general fatigue, the soldiers were probably less alert than usual. The rebels, meaning the Edomites, they looked at the appearance of the chariots and they were not welcome. With their largely irregular insurgent forces, the Edomites knew that they had little chance against the chariots in the open field. So the Edomites, rather than panic, they convinced them that the situation convinced them that their sole salvation lay in surprising the enemy in a situation where he could not exploit his superior armament. And this opportunity presented itself on that night that the exhausted Judeans decided to halt and set up camp at Zor. Under the cover of darkness, the Edomites crept up to the Judean camp and jumped off for a sudden assault from a point close to the poorly guarded perimeter. Their main objective, actually there were four main objectives. First was the person of the king himself. Second was the commanders of the chariots. Third was the chariots themselves. And last but not least were the horses. By concentrating on these four objectives, the attackers hoped to strike their enemy's offensive arm in a decisive way. Luckily for Jehoram, he was alerted in time to wake up, arm, and organize the defense of his dismounted charioteers. If the Judean camp followed the usual pattern that night, the infantry must have camped in the vicinity or around the chariots, and they too may have been able to make use of a last-minute alarm to grab their weapons and rush to the defense. The combined forces of Judah, the infantry and the dismounted charioteers, fought well, and the Edomites were beaten back. Their defeat was such that King Jehoram could then make an unmolested retreat with the forces that had fought under his personal command. Now, what had happened, this is all going on in the middle of the night. So the only forces that Jehoram had any command over were the ones that were immediately with him, where he slept. So while the king had been surrounded by attacking Edomites, he couldn't exercise any command over the rest of his camp. And the rest of his camp, with no knowledge of the king's fate, and in the absence of any appropriate leadership, the sudden attack in the dark changed into sheer panic, and the stricken soldiers fled in a headlong flight. Now, King Jehoram, who actually won this little skirmish, was now deprived of a large portion of his forces. So Jehoram was forced to call off his campaign, and then domestic problems back on the home front erupted, so he needed to focus on that. So he departed Edom and Edom then made its independence final. Edom was able to preserve its independence for the next 2 generations, about 35 years. Judah was at its lowest point and deprived of Israel's shield against the Arameans in the north, and because of the disastrous aftermath of Jehu's revolt, Judah kind of stood alone against the full might of Damascus, which was now at the peak of its power. So now let's jump to map. This one. King Hazael of Damascus was about to implement the age-old dream of making Damascus the overlord of the entire Palestinian land bridge by bringing all of its highways under his direct control. If successful, his dominant position in world trade would have brought him into a position in world affairs equal to that of King David and King Solomon back in their times. The neighbors' neighbors were, as so often is in geopolitical setting, once again a natural ally. Moab in the south, and Edom further south in the east, and the Philistines on the coast in the west, would much prefer a far distant Aramean government up in Damascus rather than live in the shadow of the Jews. In his campaigns, talking about King Hazael, during the last 2 decades of the 9th century BC, Hazael captured first the entire King's Highway in Transjordan, right here, linking up at the Arnon River with Moab. And then he captured the entire Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, or the Great International Route, has 3 names, and linked up with the Philistines down in Gad. Both the Moabites and the Philistines, as well as the Edomites, were certainly happy to act as carriers and intermediaries in any trade activities that were emanating from Damascus. At this point, King Hazael failed to carry out his plan through to a logical conclusion. It could be that he judged that he was not able to do so, or by abstaining from conquering the Cisjordanian central mountain masses of Judah here and Samaria here, he left the Jews in command of the main central watershed route, or the Way of the Patriarchs, in the center of the natural mountain bastion. And moving up and down on this central interior line, the Jews continued to command the approaches to the flanks of both the King's Highway and the Via Maris. Consequently, they could bide their time until the appropriate moment presented itself to move down from the mountains and reestablish their authority over the lost territories and the trade routes. Okay. Let's look here. You saw this map before. The first to take the initiative this time were the Judeans, with the Aramean attention in the north being focused on the Assyrian front in about 785 BC. King Amaziah of Judah staged a campaign to try to reconquer Edom. It seems that Amaziah followed the same plan that King Jehoram had used, but keeping in mind the lessons learned so as to avoid the same pitfalls. And when the armies met in the Vale of Salt, or the Valley of Salt, some 6 miles south of the oasis at Zor, the Judeans inflicted a crushing defeat on the Edomites that paved the way for the reconquest of all of northern Edom, including the capital of the country, Selah, whose name King Jehoram had changed to Joktheel. And that's in 2 Kings 14:7.
He was the one who defeated 10,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt and captured Selah in battle, calling it Joktheel, the name it has to this day.
So there are a couple of interesting sidelights to the biblical narrative of Amaziah's Edomite campaign. And they're in a parallel account in 2 Chronicles chapter 25. So later on, if you get a chance, you might want to read all of that, Second Chronicles chapter 25. And it provides a lot more detail. First is there was an official census of the male population in Judah, which may have been updated at fixed intervals, but was definitely taken prior to any planned large-scale military activities. And second, when you get a chance to read it, is that the age of compulsory national service was fixed at age 20. King Amaziah was a pretty strong-minded, strong-willed ruler with far-reaching aspirations. In his time, we have the first strong evidence for a corps of cavalry, not chariots, the Judean army. But for all his success, he failed to take from Israel the status of primary ruler from among the Jewish kingdoms. Nevertheless, the outcome of his efforts was the reestablishment of an active alliance between the two sister kingdoms, which served as a basis for the second golden age of biblical Israel. This was expressed in the re-extension of Jewish dominion over a major part of the territory of what was the former United Monarchy. So they spread out quite a bit. Now, finally, we turn to our last king that we'll talk about today, that's King Uzziah. Since the national security is always influenced by many more factors than military matters, which is the main focus of all these sessions, we can't forget that cultural, social, religious, and economic forces were always at work. And these were always instrumental in enabling Uzziah to achieve his military feats. If you look at 2 Chronicles 26, 6 through 8.
He went to war against the Philistines and broke down the walls of Gath, Jabesh, and Ashdod. He then rebuilt the towns near Ashdod and elsewhere among the Philistines. God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabs who lived in Gurbaal and against the Meunites. The Ammonites brought tribute to Hosea, and his fame spread as far as the borders of Egypt because he had become very powerful.
And he became very powerful. Why? It's in that next to the last verse. Who did he get help from?
God.
There you go. Ken got it. Like I said, you can't just go with just the military. You got to consider everything: religion, culture, economics. So Uzziah was able to reduce the Philistines once more to a state of absolute vassaldom. To ensure his grip, he dismantled the fortifications of some of their main towns, and he put Judean garrisons in Philistine towns and Philistine territory. The geopolitical and geoeconomic interrelationship between the Philistines, the Arab tribes of the Negev, and the southern Transjordan, talking about Edom, is well known to us at this point. With the reduction of Philistia, the Negev tribes were economically at the mercy of Judah for their trade outlets. The chronology is not clear, but either before or after the conquest of the Philistine coast, King Uzziah completed the reduction of Edom that was begun by his father, and he refurbished the naval base at Etzion Geber at Eilat. Another of Uzziah's great achievements concerns the Negev proper, and that's in 2 Chronicles 26:10.
He also built towers in the wilderness and dug many cisterns, because he had much livestock in the foothills and in the plain. He had people working his fields and vineyards in the hills and in the fertile lands, for he loved the soil.
Okay. Policing the Negev and maintaining its roads and traffic meant maintaining a wide-ranging network of forts, strongholds, towers, checkpoints, protected water sources, signal stations, and the like. Maintaining all of these meant the deployment of a permanent force of many thousands. The problems involved were many, especially after the split of the monarchy. How could Judah muster enough troops on a permanent basis or even reserves on a rotation schedule just for this one task without neglecting other vital commitments? Last but not least, there was the human element. Modern soldiers can be kept in good spirits by NCO clubs and canteens and concerts and shows and radio, television, as well as constant postal service, email, texting back home. In the Negev, ways and means had to be found to enable the troops stationed in the wilderness to go on leave and visit their homes and their families back in the settled parts of the country. The answer to all these difficulties was the prototype of the solution to the same problem in all the ages that followed, i.e. the permanent settlement of the Negev, and requiring that the defense of the area be the responsibility of the settlers themselves. The traveler in the Negev could see in many places a typical trinity of construction. There would be a fortress or a fort on a well-chosen tactical position, usually on a hilltop, with good all-around field of view. Right below the walls of the fort, just on the outside, there would be a village on the slopes under the walls of the fortress. And next to that would be an extensive water catchment and storage works on the lower slopes and in the valleys at the foot of the fortress hill. While the settlers provided the soldiers in the fortress with their rations and all their daily needs, the fortress and its garrison provided protection for the town's agricultural settlement, as well as protection of the waterworks that were vital to both of them. Again, with the roaming nomad tribes around, only through constant vigilance and the existence of the fortress, both as a deterrent and as a refuge, was civil life possible in this wilderness. All these installations appear to have been planned according to a single blueprint, and their construction seems to have been simultaneous. So whenever Judah prospered and the population grew above a certain maximum, the problem of reserves of arable land arose. When you're hemmed in by the Mediterranean Sea on the west and by your sister kingdom Israel to the north and the desert, Transjordan desert on the east, and Edom, the only land reserves available to Judah were the Negev. So by directing the overflow of the population into the Negev, the Judean kings simultaneously eased the pressure on the settled parts of their realm, created new households for the needy, multiplied the amount of land under cultivation, created a secure logistics infrastructure for trade and defense of the Negev, and gave additional depth to the network of fortifications built to prevent the nomad tribes, and created the manpower to undertake the border and road defense and to finance these efforts, at least partly, by their own handiwork. There's another case where King Uzziah followed the Solomonic tradition. Although the Philistines were subdued by King Uzziah, he made no attempt to exterminate or even decisively weaken his age-old enemy, and one of the most dangerous, and one who could never miss an opportunity to attack Judah in its rear when it was being attacked by superior forces elsewhere. The reason for this was that the Philistines served Judah much as the Tyrians had served Israel, as the maritime carriers of their national trade. With commercial connections guarded as trade secrets, much of the overland trade through the Negev was also in Philistine hands. And King Uzziah, like his ancestors, was afraid to cut off this branch that made much of his trade enterprise meaningful. It could be that by giving towns like Gaza and Ashkelon preferential treatment, and by not tearing down its walls, King Uzziah hoped to induce the Philistines to a more positive working relationship. Anyone who studies military history remembers that Wellington's famous complaint that he could do either of two things. Number one, comply with all the administrative red tape that's demanded by the British Secretary of War, or 2, lead his troops and win battles. Take your pick. Now, old soldiers like myself agree that red tape has gotten in the way of many tactical operations. But on the other hand, we also agree that sound staff work is one of the prerequisites of victory. So we're thankful to get even a small glimpse of Uzziah's general headquarters. There were 3 functionaries in his headquarters, and they're mentioned. A chief of staff called Hananiah, who commanded the army in the king's absence. There was Jael, who was what we would call today the adjutant general, or the G1, which is chief of personnel, who kept the army rolls and was in charge of all the clerical work. And his Hebrew title was Sofer, which literally means scribe, denoted the additional duty of chief of intelligence. And Shoter, whose duties included the overseeing and enforcing of the orders coming from the general headquarters, and possibly the running of the logistics department, or at least parts of it. King Uzziah's forces were armed with the traditional Judean weapons, as mentioned in 2 Chronicles 26:14.
Uzziah provided shields, spears, helmets, coats of honor, bows, and sling stones for the entire army.
One more component of King Uzziah's military establishment deserves mention. The hereditary caste of the Gabora, which is the mighty men of valor as it's described in the King James translation. These seem to be partly the offspring of David's elite guard of Gaborim, who were given land by the king and who formed a knightly caste that served as the backbone of the army, though being landowners. They were rather more a part of the militia than of the regulars. As men of means and certain leisure, they had time to exercise in the use of arms more than ordinary citizens. And their number is given as 2,600 families and was part of the national levy. And that's in Chronicles 26:12-13.
The total number of family leaders over the fighting men was 2,600. Under their command was an army of 307,500 men trained for war, a powerful force to support the king against his enemy.
So with these forces, King Uzziah achieved his military victories. And as the chief of the Syro-Palestinian coalition, he led his army and that of his allies as far north as Hamath, up on the Orontes River, which is north off of this map, to meet the Assyrians. The Battle of Hamath in 739 BC seems to have been an impasse. This time, however, the might of the Assyrians was not broken, and in 738 BC, Tiglath-Pileser renewed his invasion, and as the coalition had broken up, he was able to capture the whole of Syria. According to the Assyrian annals, even King Uzziah was compelled to pay homage to the victor. Yet it seems certain that healthy respect for the Judean armed forces was among the reasons why Tiglath-Pileser refrained from pressing his southern campaign in 734 BC. Tiglath-Pileser stopped short of pushing into the Judah proper. You might recall back in session 7, when we talked about Israel under Omri and Ahab, when Ahab led the Israelite forces against Assyrian forces up at the marshes of Karkar on the Orontes River. Remember the logistics that were involved, that really long train and all the camels and all the supplies and the length of time it took. Remember that? Well, the logistics involved in Uzziah's Syrian campaign were probably about the same that we discussed back then. So what do we know about the order of marching, camping, communications, and tactical evolutions of the Judean field forces? Luckily, the book of Numbers has preserved interesting details of the exodus from Egypt, which certainly may be applied to the practice in the Judean kingdom. According to Numbers chapter 10, if you read it later, the march through potentially hostile territory was in 4 major combat formations divided into 3 divisions each. The headquarters and the staff moved after the 1st division, and the field sanctuary, presumably together with the supply train, moved between the 2nd and 3rd divisions. The main column was preceded by an advance guard that had among its duties the choice of marking out of the camp for the next night. These arrangements are not basically different from those followed in modern times. The posting of the headquarters behind the 1st combat formation allowed for its immediate security if the head of the column came upon the enemy. Enough troops were forward to deal with the most immediate problems, and the commander was both sufficiently advanced to gather first-hand intelligence of the situation and sufficiently removed from first contact to be able to deliberate and decide on what the most appropriate course of action, while the bulk of his troops behind him were still yet uncommitted. So to make good use of the time and men available, the commander needed to deploy and direct his troops with short, conventional signals. The Israelites used for most of this purpose both standards, which were long poles topped with colored cloth, or even woven cloth, flags with symbols, and wind instruments, horns and so forth, that made noise. And that's why I wasn't going to go into those last couple of verses, because basically what that describes is the signals that they use and what the signals meant. And of course, you're free to read that on, and you probably already did on your own. And when they talk about these standards, one last thing I want to show you. Nobody really knows what these standards look like or what these symbols or flags look like. There's been a number of different versions of what people think they may have looked like, but nobody knows for sure. But when I was researching this, I did discover, if I can find it here, I did discover that there was a specific pattern, and they all seem to agree on the same symbology. And if I can show that to you, yeah, there it is. Let me share this. Boom. There. So obviously we don't know that the individual tribes, each of their standards looked anything like this. However, in all the resources I found, they all seem to follow the same symbology. In other words, the tribe of Asher was always a palm tree. Benjamin was always a wolf. The tribe of Dan was always a snake, and so forth. But from the time of the Exodus out of Egypt, this is how they signaled. They would use their colors and maybe symbols on flags or standards waved at certain times to mean certain things, and they would often use like ram's horns and wind instruments to call attention to the flags. In other words, you're not always looking at these flags to see what to do next. So they would blow the horns to grab your attention, to say, look. You would look and you'd see the flag, and then however they waved the flag, you knew what action you took. Whether it was, it's your turn to break camp and move, it's your turn to break camp and move, or whatever. So that's kind of what I cut out to abbreviate the session to get it down to 90 minutes, and I still have 3 minutes left.
It was like starting the Morse code with the flag.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's see. Are there any questions?
Warren, I'm just curious. When the king came down and took over both sides of Israel and Judah from Syria, how did he maintain that? I mean, it's obviously he's in enemy territory.
Yeah, well, not all at once, because the kingdom of Israel fell first.
Right.
The kingdom of Israel fell about 135 years before Judah fell.
Okay.
So the kingdom of Israel was no longer unfriendly territory. It was a Syrian province.
Okay.
It was a Syrian territory.
That just looked like a long.
And when he.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when he moved and when he conquered Israel, he exiled them back to Babylon, and he brought back Gentiles. And the Gentiles then populated that whole area.
Okay. All right. So he brought in friendly people to maintain it.
He brought in friendly people.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I just thought that was a pretty extensive line to maintain, for all
Yeah.
those trade routes.
Yeah, but it still took another 135 years before the Assyrian Empire never really conquered Judah, but the Babylonians did, and then the Persians did, and then Alexander the Great was next, and then the Romans were after him. So one right after the other.
Yeah, in those times, it's almost like the major part of their life was preparing for battles and attacks, and that's all they did.
Yeah, life was hard then.
It sure
It really was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a place I would want to grow up.
No.
No.
But I mean, that's how they survived in the desert, I guess.
Yeah.
No, it's not all that different today. There's still Bedouins roaming the deserts out there. I had a chance to run across a few of them when I was running around the desert. One of the things you'll find out about the Bedouins is that they're, number one, a-religious. They have no religion. And number two, they're apolitical. They don't care who they tell what. So they were always a great source of strategic and tactical intelligence, because you sit around the campfire in the middle of the desert, and by their rules, they must, offer you rest, and they must offer you tea. So you sit around and you rest and you drink tea, and they'll tell you anything you want to know. They don't care. It was funny. My gunnery sergeant in my unit when I was over there, his real name, I'm not joking, his real name was Osama bin Shafani. He was Jordanian. He was born in Jordan. Right after he was born, his parents fled to America. So he grew up his entire life in the U.S., but he spoke fluent Farsi, and of course he looked the part. So it was very easy for him to put on the man dress, and the headdress, and he'd wander off into the desert, and he'd meet the Bedouins, and he'd sit around and drink tea, and he'd come back with a ton of information. And then after I left and retired, he left shortly after and retired, and he became a consultant in Hollywood on all these films about war in Afghanistan, like the Green Zone and all that. So he's a Hollywood consultant.
Wow.
Great guy. Osama bin Shafani.
So who needs to spend money on satellites? We could have him walk out there.
Well, that's it for this week.